So this video is my rant about problems with academia, and also why we should keep it, and why the problems that people think are problems aren't what we should be worried about. Some shit about gay squirrels, and people believe it. I'm Will, and you're watching Thinking Linguistically. It's Will from the future here to warn you that there's going to be profanity. There's been a lot about academia and science and cuts in the news lately, particularly in America, and some of it affects like people I know. And anyway, this is a video partly about that I could complain about endlessly, and partly about how fascism in America might mortally wound the academy. Yay! Not literally yay, that's just like an awkward thing that I say. Helps cover up the confronting of bad news. One of the things that I don't think people outside of, university systems really appreciate is how fragile this whole endeavor is. Universities are kind of like glaciers. Building for millennia, slight change in greenhouse gas emissions causes them to melt dramatically quickly. Like, it's a thing that academia moves at kind of glacially slow pace, particularly compared to like the private sector. This is much worse in linguistics. My first real journal paper, between when it was accepted and when it was actually published, was more than a year. Linguistics is maybe slower than most. Some other fields, I think, move a little bit faster. Chemistry, you get journals that come out every 6 weeks and that have lots of papers, and the papers themselves are shorter. In particularly theoretical linguistics, no, it takes quite a lot of space and time to develop an argument, particularly because you have to do all these layers of interpreting data and framing generalizations and going from facts to generalizations to theories and whatnot, and all of that takes time and space. But there's also other ways in which academia is slow. I'm told that if you get fired in the private sector, they will hire someone to replace you within 2 weeks, and not a chance for academic jobs. In the fields I'm familiar with, there's kind of one season where all of the job ads for the entire year are posted, and that'll be August through December. And then if you don't get a job from one of those things, you have to wait again until the whole next year and the next cycle. It's not the kind of system you would design if you were trying to make a system that would work. Why is it so complicated? Well, partly it's probably because universities are themselves very complicated entities. They have lots of internal structure. So there's lots of layers of oversight. There's already oversight. Probably not simpler because of tenure and the possibility of having to spend the entire rest of your career or someone else's career working together in the same department is maybe a more high stakes type of hiring decision than you get in other career paths. Anyway, the point I wanted to make here is that because academia moves so slow, it is not so able to adapt. It's not as flexible or as resilient as it might appear from the outside, right? You look at a university, you think, oh, these buildings aren't going anywhere. You think there will be students again next year, and that's all true until it isn't. When you have a situation where there's so many moving parts, it's hard to plan. Plans take years to put into place and can fall apart immediately. Even something that sounds as benign as a temporary pause on grant funding can actually completely wreck a project. If you can't count on timing to sync up, well, then you can't make a plan. I also think it's especially useful to look backwards. So there's a historical trend that stretches out behind us from where we sit. Once you see it, it kind of makes it look like we are going in not a very good direction. So, okay, a little bit about me. I'm an American. You can probably tell from my accent. I am recording this where I live in South Africa. I work at a university here. But I did my training, all my degrees in America. I've also worked in Canada. Calgary was recently in the news because I think they were booing junior hockey players. Something about foreign policy. I don't fucking know. You stay classy, Alberta. Anyway, my point was that I'm familiar enough with how things work to be able to explain some of this to people who don't work in this bizarre niche. I'll also mention here that I'm recording this in February of 2025. So this is the early days of the second Trump administration, in case this video lasts more than 4 years. Kind of feels like it might at this rate. Anyway, the bit of the zeitgeist that I want to pick out is this sort of rightward shift towards more authoritarian ideologies and away from kind of bland, tolerant pluralism. There's all this crazy shit happening right now with the U.S. National Institute of Health and the National Science Foundation and something called Doge that's not from Venice. Fun fact, Elon Musk actually came to the United States first on a student visa. He was supposed to be a PhD student in physics. So our current political climate has sort of highlighted this conception of waste and frivolous expenditure, particularly in the realm of education, right? And the threat to cut the Department of Education in America is looming in the background. I think there's a mismatch between what's going on and the way that these things are presented in sort of narratives that you might find in the media. So like this meme is something that you find from the right, some shit about gay squirrels. So the right tends to present this as, oh no, the gay squirrel expert is going to be out of a job. How's he going to take care of his family? The implicature intended is we shouldn't have an analyst for gay squirrels. There aren't a lot of gay squirrels in Zimbabwe. There's no one who works in gay squirrel specializations in eastern Zimbabwe. It's a red herring. It's a straw man. I happen to know that there aren't a lot of gay squirrels in Zimbabwe because there aren't a lot of squirrels in Zimbabwe. I checked. I have checked all of the species listed on Wikipedia, looking to see if there were Zimbabwean squirrels. At first, I thought there were no squirrels at all in Zimbabwe, but I was mistaken. Key things that I learned from this bizarre squirrel hole. Number one, the real squirrel diversity hotspots are Southeast Asia and sort of the western coast of Mesoamerica into North America. Finding number two is we should give an honorable moment of consideration to the least pygmy squirrel, who, if you ask me, is kind of the most pygmy squirrel out there. We don't have a ton of squirrels here in Southern Africa. Like, you know, that's not an animal you see around a lot. There are, of course, some, but like I know the Cape ground squirrel has a range that doesn't reach up into Zimbabwe. There are, of course, tree squirrels in Zimbabwe. Several species. Most of them, of course, named after dead white guys. So you've got like Alexander's bush squirrel, Boehm's bush squirrel, Cooper's mountain squirrel, the striped bush squirrel. The green bush squirrel is a little confusing to me. There's also the mutable sun squirrel. Anyway, there is Smith's bush squirrel. Does live in Zimbabwe. And, oh, look, you can see him fucking. Man. This species of squirrel also practices a particular behavior called mutual grooming, which I'll concede. Mutual grooming seems a little gay. Should be obvious, though. Like, of course, no one from USAid is wasting time on gay squirrels in eastern Zimbabwe. U.S. foreign aid is not being used for this. What they are doing is a bunch of healthcare and agricultural things. You know, like trying to stop the spread of HIV. I will admit that I do find the idea of a gay squirrel specialist a little bit funny, particularly in eastern Zimbabwe. The Zimbabweans also find it funny, but there isn't any, like, U.S. foreign aid going to things like this. This tweet from some right-wing asshat who just wants to kind of frame a narrative in a particular way. The trouble is that often that way of framing it is not quite right. For example, one of the species of squirrel that I mentioned is the prime culprit suspected for the monkeypox outbreak in Democratic Republic of Congo in 2022. You remember monkeypox? That, like, global pandemic that happened? Not after COVID. Yeah. Like, after that last outbreak, the response was like, hey, don't let it happen again. So this is how we don't let it happen again, is we study shit. The point I want to make here is, even if there was someone from USAid studying gay squirrels in eastern Zimbabwe, they would be doing it for a fucking reason. There are good reasons to study things. Even things that, like, don't seem like they would affect you. A key thing about this narrative is the idea is clearly a transparent attempt to frame certain kinds of knowledge as good and other kinds of knowledge as bad. Practical stuff, good. Poetry, bad. I'm not even going to make an argument for, like, the principled reasons to care about humanities research. That's for another video. Just from a logical standpoint, I don't see why the order should be that way. Like, why should you label these in this way and not the other way around? What I want to say is what you label as waste seems like an extremely flaky concept at best, right? One person's waste is actually something that's deeply important for saving another person's life. Or, you know, like changing the dynamics in a community so that the youth stop committing suicide at outlandish rates. Even leaving all that shit aside, there's still an intrinsic value in helping people. Funny story, the day after I recorded that, one of my former students showed up in my office to return a book that I had lent her. And also to tell me that she's going home. Her name's Ntabiseng. She speaks a language called Kalobedu. We'll probably do a video about that together at some point. Anyway, Ntabiseng's funding fell through which means she now has to move back home, send all of her possessions back home. She had 2 days to do it and no income. So I'm fortunate I was able to help her out, but this is the kind of difficulty that a lot of people don't realize you encounter in academia. She was ready to go and do masters. Now she has to wait a whole year to try again. And a lot of people can't do that. Part of why academia is so fragile and why science is so fragile is it is so easy for these complicated systems to break down. Like the slightest interruption can ruin plans that have been years in the making. It can take years to develop a good mouse model to study a particular disease, but the mice can die in a span of a couple of weeks. Say, for example, because the building's closed, or because the funding for the food didn't come through, or because the person who was supposed to take care of them was not available because their funding fell through. There are many points where things can go wrong, and you have to make sure that none of them go wrong in order for a successful plan to go off. Linguistics is frequently one of those disciplines that gets put on the chopping block first when there's waste to be trimmed. A real smart linguist I know put this in his CV, actually, after he was summarily axed from a tenured position. I think it was the day after the university wrote up a press release about how awesome his new research grant was. Yikes. That happened a couple of years ago, but you see, endless versions of the same kind of story happening again. We in linguistics worry about some of this stuff a little bit more. There's a core set of things that are sort of taken as given at the university level. Linguistics is not among those. A lot of real small universities have great linguistics programs, and a lot of big, well-funded universities have fuck all. So we tend to feel the force of contractions sooner than other disciplines when there's a broad-scale trend. Like, for example, the Trump administration's war on science. One example that came on my radar just the other day is University of Illinois at Chicago cutting its School of Literatures, Cultural Studies, and Linguistics. This came on my radar because two of the people in that department are Jose Camacho and Liliana Sanchez, who are people I knew when I was doing my PhD in America. They are extremely kind. They're super supportive. They're brilliant. They should be doing what they're doing. The pretext for closing the school is that there's a $22 million deficit. It's not at all clear that closing this department is going to fix that deficit. From a purely financial perspective, this is probably a step in the wrong direction. Humanities departments generally generate more revenue than what they cost to run. It's a trope among deans that humanities are what fund universities. I know that because you could fact check this yourself. It's also not really hard to understand how this situation arises. Science labs are costly things to run. You need all sorts of special equipment, whereas a group of people sitting around discussing a book costs virtually nothing. So it's sort of natural that disciplines that need less research expenditure would cost less to run, and therefore, would be more revenue positive. So here is University of Illinois Chicago about to cut their Spanish department and stop teaching people Spanish. Why is it a bad idea to teach Americans Spanish? Coming at it from either side. If you think that there's a mass flow of people across the southern border of the US, it would behoove you to learn the language that they speak. It'll make your life easier whether you want them there or not. Nobody immigrates anywhere by being lazy. I'm a little biased because I'm an immigrant myself. This is an extremely complicated thing to do. We'll do another video about it. The point I want to make is that when you're short on money, it does not make sense to sell the most profitable portion of the business or to shutter it. Yet, that's still the narrative that gets presented, right? These things get held up as useless in comparison with, mechanical engineering or useless courses like ethics. You could also make an argument that, humanities is perhaps most core to keeping the concept of education and the concept of a university on track, right? The academic project stays true to purpose because of things we believe about ethics and whatnot. There's also the matter that behind a lot of the smears of frivolous or useless research, you find stuff that's actually really valuable and or really necessary. There was a story in the media a little while ago about the US government creating 2 new domains, buying waste.gov and DEI.gov. Stuff was only up for maybe half an hour. A German historian called Henrik Schönemann, not this guy, this is the actual guy, was able to log the content before it got removed. So you have this off-the-books list of things that Doge thought were wasteful projects. One of these is 1 million for foreign DEI programs, including indigenous language technology in Guatemala. The work of one Robert Henderson, semanticist at University of Arizona. 1 million on video games to help LGBT youth stop binge drinking. Why is that bad? 3.4 million for a Malaysian drug-fueled gay sex app. I'm sure that exists. $500,000 for research on indigenous knowledge, a pseudoscience that posits native Indians possess unique insights into the workings of the universe. That is not what indigenous knowledge studies look for. Usually, here in South Africa, often it's like talk to people about medicinal uses of plants and find new medicines that Western science hasn't figured out yet. This is like your cancer cure from the Amazon shit. Basically also where pepadoos come from. Those are pretty good. $15,000 for queer Muslim writers in India. What does it matter? $15,000 is a drop in the bucket in the grand scheme of the US budget. There's also the matter that when you are doing some kind of nefarious foreign propaganda thing, you tend not to call it by its actual name. You give it one of these nonsense platitudes. The names don't tell you anything about what this money is going towards. One of the other things on that list was $2.1 billion for the BBC to strengthen the media ecosystem in Libya, designed to value the diversity of Libyan society. I'm getting sidetracked. Let's talk about Guatemala. It seems particularly rich to me for anyone in the US to say that it's a waste to spend money trying to stabilize Guatemala after the many, many different things that the US has done to destabilize it. Isn't that literally where the term Banana Republic came from? One thing that many Americans don't know about is the Guatemala syphilis experiments. A lot of people have heard about the Tuskegee syphilis experiments, where a whole bunch of African Americans were left untreated for syphilis just to see how the disease would take its course, even though a cure had been developed. We talked about that when I taught research ethics the other day. There's a popular misconception also that this study involved giving people syphilis to see what would happen. No, that's what they did in Guatemala. This is not hyperbole. The same guy who ran the Tuskegee syphilis thing where they just watched people suffer, also ran these experiments where they basically recruited poor Guatemalans, mostly indigenous folks, to give them syphilis and see what would happen. This is like Nazi war crime shit. Indigenous identity is also kind of an important thing in understanding the politics in Guatemala. I don't know that it's a distinctly American thing to sort out the messes you create, but it seems like the nice thing to do, the right thing to do, right? There's also a whole lot of stuff that we can learn by studying languages that are very different from the ones that we know very well. So, as an English speaker, I'm used to certain things. I might even make assumptions about how languages work around the world. I might assume things about how brains work based on my understanding of English that will turn out to be false and damaging to assume if I cannot disprove them. This is one of the reasons why Mayan languages are especially interesting. They have very different grammatical structures to Indo-European languages. I think a lot of them are verb initial, for example, which is pretty rare. They're full of ejectives. There's interesting consonant stuff going on. There's a weird little further bit of irony here, which is that Robert Henderson also recently published a book about dog whistles, dog whistles in the sense of political messages, and looking at the formal semantics of this, which looks really cool. I haven't read it yet. I don't think that there's a connection, but I do want to point out that it's not the good kind of coincidence. It's the bad kind. To make this video less depressing for me to make, I brought an example of the good kind of coincidence as well. This thing about the data from DEI.gov being downloaded by Henrik Schönemann was reported by 404 Media. Originally, it was reported by a German publication called netpolitik.org. The story was written by one Markus Reuter, which is interesting in that the piece about DEI.gov being registered in the first place was a story reported by Reuters. It's the same name. So this is a story reported by several Reuterses. It's a plural that consists of a plural and a singular. So academia has problems, and yeah, there's things that could be fixed, but cutting it isn't going to fix any of them. And ultimately, education is a thing that all societies need. If you don't have education institutions like universities, well, then you can't reap the benefits from generation to generation of anything that you learn that builds up over time. You don't get technology. Do not buy into this bullshit narrative of this is wasteful use of taxpayer money. Teaching children is never wasteful use of money. It's something that needs to be done. Ultimately, we're all children. Anyway, it's hard to deal with an irrational problem, and I think that's the situation we are in, right? It would be one thing if these bits of research were identified as useless on the basis of some financial metric, like, how much they cost or how efficiently the money is used or some third thing. That's not what happens. Instead, someone says, oh, I think this is useless, therefore, waste.gov. So Trump and Musk, they would have you believe that they're cutting support for the Mutare Mutable Sun Squirrel Grinder project. But then what they're actually doing is like this, firing more than 10% of NSF's workforce in one day just because, and doing it after they had changed the policies last month to make it easier to fire people without explanation. This is going about things so blindly and so clumsily that it is very obviously deliberate. The intent is not to find waste that's happening and fix it as a problem. Instead, the intent is to change the system in a way that can't be undone by any next administration. One thing you know about Trump is he's always serving his ego, and what better way do you serve your ego than by doing something just to maximize the size of your legacy without caring about whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. So we have a system of sort of knowledge pursuit and science and higher education that is built to optimize for certain things, but resisting bad faith interference is not one of them. I'm no expert in game theory, but I think it's a problem when the two players think that the rules are different. You can still take turns, but you're not playing the same game. See, if we were dealing with a good faith kind of interaction, we could, compare evidence and have an evidence-based conclusion. We could, see which things are effective and which are not. That's not what we do. That's not how academia works. That's one of the reasons why it's dumb. It's one of the reasons I made this channel, is to just recreationally complain about it. But when the proposed solution to a budget deficit is to cut the things that generate money, you're not dealing with a rational decision-making process. You cannot present these things as though they are an honest discourse when they ultimately are not. Which means you can't present arguments and have them make sense. We are not in the realm of logic. We are in some other realm of, I don't know, whatever the fuck politics is. It would be one thing if there was a pressure to cut funding just for the kinds of projects that are expensive to run, or the kinds of projects that are expensive relative to how beneficial they are. That's not what's happening. What we get instead is, some asshat in a position of authority or power who decides that something is useless and is, basically just not on their agenda, and so they vilify it. All knowledge is equally useless until you put it to use. We can't call any one kind of knowledge useless if we aren't trying to use it. You have to know it before you can try to use it. I would contend that things that we learn from the humanities and social sciences are put to use every single day because they are what keep the academic project on track, true to purpose. The only way we know to look at enrollment data or earnings data or alumni whatevers is because we have social science that looks for these kinds of trends across populations. Academia is the way it is and has the problems that it has because it has accumulated over time. The way that we do things is not optimal, sure. It's not set up because we're trying to solve this problem. It's set up because this is the best we can set up in the fucking circumstances. So linguistics is in perhaps more peril than other kinds of sciences in that a lot of the stuff that generates the useful insights is also stuff that can be smeared by dishonest agents as being irrelevant to you. Relevant to you is not the point. Linguistics has always been in this kind of weird limbo where it's we try to do it like a science, but because it's a science of human behavior, it tends to get lumped in with humanities, and it is kind of a humanity. So even though large language models are a thing that everyone's talking about the potential of, you will still see cuts to linguistics. Why? I don't know, and there's not really anything I can do about it from where I am. So I made a video. Anyway, I'm worried about the future of universities and education and this general trend away from understanding for the sake of understanding and towards only doing things that we can immediately see the purpose of, which is not really how you learn and not really how you do science. The essence of science is poking at the stuff you don't know. That's the scientific method. Poke at it and make a guess. We do this because we're trying to understand how the world works, how societies work, how people work, how minds work, how particles work, everything. Trying to short sell that is like trying to sell your future to improve your past. You can't go back to it. I can't give you back the time you spent watching this video, but at least you learned something. Maybe only about squirrels. Anyway, good thing the climate's changing and we're all fucked. Oh, all of us except the billionaires.